A single man steps onto an empty road. In front of him stands a wall of soldiers, muskets up, fingers on triggers. They have one order: kill him. He doesn't draw a weapon, he doesn't run. He walks straight toward the guns, stops, and tears open his coat, baring his chest. "If you want to kill your emperor," he says, "here I am." What happens in the next 10 seconds is one of the most impossible moments in history. A man who had lost everything takes back an entire empire, without firing a single shot. This is how Napoleon escaped exile and conquered France with nothing but his own face. To understand why those soldiers were about to weep instead of fire, we have to rewind 1 year to the lowest point of Napoleon's life. For over a decade, this man had been the most powerful human being on earth. His armies had humbled every great power in Europe. Kings owed him their crowns. And then it all came apart. A catastrophic invasion of Russia swallowed 500,000 men and bled his army white. His enemies, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, finally united, marched on Paris, and in 1814 forced the unthinkable. Napoleon abdicated. The Emperor of Europe was finished. But the men who beat him made one critical mistake. They didn't execute him. Instead, they exiled him to a tiny island off the coast of Italy, Elba, barely 12 miles across. And in what they thought was a clever humiliation, they let him keep the title Emperor. Emperor of a rock you could walk across in an afternoon. He threw himself into it at first, reorganizing the island, building roads, playing at being a king. But his eyes never left the horizon, because across that water, France was already souring on the king the Allies had forced back onto the throne. Louis XVIII had returned in the baggage train of France's enemies, and he brought the old world back with him. Émigré aristocrats who had fled the revolution now swaggered back into Paris, demanding their lands and their titles, sneering at the men who had bled for the tricolour. And Napoleon's veterans, the soldiers who had marched across a continent, were thrown onto half pay and sent home. They sat in their villages, missing the eagle, missing the glory, missing him. France was a furnace of resentment, and everyone could feel the heat. And then came a whisper that changed everything. Rumors that Napoleon's pension would never be paid and that he was about to be shipped somewhere far worse, a speck in the middle of the Atlantic, forever. So Napoleon made a decision that should have gotten him killed. He was going home. On the 26th of February 1815, while the British officer assigned to watch him was conveniently away, Napoleon slipped aboard a small ship with around 1,000 loyal men of his old guard. 1,000 men. The king who wanted him dead commanded an army of 200,000. By every rule of war ever written, this was suicide. 3 days later, he landed on the southern coast of France. The moment his boot hit the sand, he was a wanted man in his own country, and every soldier in France had orders to stop him. But Napoleon was betting on something no army could measure on a map. He was betting that the soldiers sent to kill him still loved him. He avoided the royalist coast and led his men up into the freezing Alps on a route so brutal it still bears his name today, the Route Napoleon. And to understand the gamble he was making, you have to understand who was waiting for him. For 20 years, the soldiers of France had followed this man into hell, across burning deserts, over frozen rivers, through the smoke of 100 battlefields. He had slept in their camps, learned their faces, and pinned medals on their chests with his own hand. To the kings of Europe, Napoleon was a monster. But to the men who had bled for him, he was something closer to a father. The new king in Paris had their obedience. Napoleon was about to bet his life that he still had their hearts. And near a frozen lake at a place called Laffrey, the moment he couldn't avoid finally arrived. The king's troops were waiting for him. The 5th Regiment of the Line, drawn up across the road, muskets loaded, under direct orders to stop the traitor by any means. For a long moment, the two sides simply stared at each other across the snow. Napoleon's officers begged him to wait, to send men around, to do anything but what he was about to do. Instead, he did the one thing no commander in history does. He ordered his own soldiers to lower their weapons, and then he handed his life to the enemy. He stepped out in front of his men, completely alone, and began to walk. Slowly, across open ground, straight into the muzzles of 100 loaded muskets. The royal officer screamed at his men to fire. Not a single trigger moved. Napoleon stopped, just paces from the line. He threw open his greatcoat, baring his chest, and, as the story is told, called out, "Soldiers of the 5th, you know me. If there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." Silence, a line of loaded guns, trembling hands, and a single unarmed man daring them to pull the trigger. And then, one voice, then 10, then the whole regiment throwing their hats into the air and roaring, "Vive l'Empereur!" The men sent to kill him tore the white badge of the king from their coats, turned their muskets around and joined his march. After that, it was less a campaign than an avalanche. Town after town threw open its gates. Regiment after regiment changed sides on sight. In desperation, the king played his final card. He sent the most famous soldier in France to stop him, Marshal Ney. Ney was a legend, the man Napoleon himself had called the bravest of the brave. But Ney had made his peace with the king, and he made the king a promise. He would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. Then Ney met his old emperor face to face, and the bravest of the brave fell to his knees. He could not do it. He embraced Napoleon and brought his entire army over with him. The last blade aimed at Napoleon's heart had turned in the king's hand. In Paris, the king fled into the night, and on the 20th of March, 1815, just 20 days after landing with 1,000 men, Napoleon was carried up the steps of his own palace on the shoulders of a roaring crowd. He had retaken the most powerful nation in Europe. No battle, no siege, not one shot fired. But here's the part the legend leaves out. That impossible comeback lit a fuse. The kings of Europe were still gathered at Vienna, carving up his old empire when the news arrived. They did not just declare war on France, they declared war on a single man. Napoleon was branded an outlaw, and the largest coalition the world had ever seen began to march. He raised one last army and threw everything into a single desperate gamble. And exactly 100 days after that triumphant return, it all ended in the rain and mud of a Belgian field called Waterloo. His old guard, the men who had followed him from Elba, who had not broken in 20 years, made one final charge into the heart of the enemy line. They were cut down where they stood. The guard, it was said, dies but does not surrender. This time there was no daring escape. They took no chances with him now. They exiled him to the loneliest place on earth, St. Helena, a wind-blasted rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, 2,000 miles from anywhere. He died there 6 years later, a prisoner staring out at an empty sea. The escape from Elba was the greatest comeback in history, and it bought him 100 days. So why did those soldiers lower their weapons? Not because of an army, not because of a threat, because of a man they could not bring themselves to fire on. A man who could conquer with a single sentence, who could turn his own executioners into his honor guard just by opening his coat. His empire did not survive, but that one moment never died. One man, an open coat, and an army that could not pull the trigger. If you like history that sounds too wild to be true, but absolutely was, subscribe and stick around. There are far more stories like this one waiting to be told. I'll see you in the past.